Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, it is the long-awaited return of our yearly running back tier list video. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking statistics and sharing with you guys my opinion regarding my top 40 running backs for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, before we get into divulging all of that information, I have two announcements. First and foremost, for those of you who have yet to do so, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we are on our way to crushing our goal of 60,000, 70,000 subscribers this offseason, and if you could help us get there, would be greatly appreciated. Again, we're making fantasy football content on the daily this offseason in order to prepare you for your upcoming drafts, and in the regular season, whether it is weekly waiver wires, weekly rankings, and Sunday morning live streams, with the singular goal of helping you capture a 2022 fantasy football championship. So be sure to subscribe today. Thank you very much. Now, our second announcement is in regards to the information that is above my head. For those of you who haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, be sure to do so because they are another way to gain an advantage upon your league mates this offseason. Again, the more and more you draft, whether it is via Underdog Fantasy in terms of their best ball tournaments, the more experience you will gain. Again, in terms of making those difficult decisions in your drafts, the more experience you have, the far more you'll be prepared for when you are drafting in your home leagues trying to win a 2022 fantasy football championship. But that's not all. If you go ahead and travel to Underdog Fantasy today and use promo code Andrew, not only will you be given a first deposit match up to $100, but it'll also include my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format. Those are rankings by tier at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, along with my top 200 flex. So that all included, sent in your direction from me personally to you, along with weekly updated rankings up until September 3rd. So regardless of when you're drafting, you're prepared to help yourself out and potentially win a 2022 fantasy football championship this year. Now, I'm sure we all see the word giveaway up top, so let's get into that information. For those of you who use promo code Andrew to sign up and make a first-time deposit between August 25th and August 28th, you will be eligible for the giveaway. This giveaway will be taking place Monday, August 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel. I will be live streaming and spinning a giant wheel with a bunch of names. For those of you who have signed up within these 4 days, you will have the opportunity of winning $50 of in-game Underdog currency. 10 of you will have an opportunity of winning, so be sure to take advantage of the opportunity here today by signing up via Underdog Fantasy. There's a link down in the description. Don't forget to use promo code Andrew today when making that first-time deposit. Thank you very much. Now that we've covered all of that information, let's get right into the running back tier list for the 2022 fantasy football season. Though many of us want players that are among the top tiers, S, A, B tier players, truly, the biggest determining factor as to whether or not you get those players is based on where you're drafting. If you have the number one overall selection, obviously you have a chance at Jonathan Taylor. While if you're at the back end of the first, that's a foregone conclusion. You're not getting Jonathan Taylor in your draft. So the biggest difference makers, the players that are going to make or break your 2022 fantasy football season, are from tiers E, F, G, H. These are the guys that are really going to make the difference. And hopefully the stats that I talk about and the opinions that I share throughout today's episode are going to give you more and more information to make you more confident in the decisions you make this offseason and help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. All right, let's get into this, beginning with our number one running back. And the only player that is going to belong in the S tier for today's video, it is Jonathan Taylor, running back of the Indianapolis Colts. Of course, over the course of the last 22 games that Jonathan Taylor has played, he has been an unstoppable force for the Colts, averaging 21.75 half PPR fantasy points per game. In that span of time, in those 22 games, he has scored a total of 28 touchdowns, and in 16 of those games, he has totaled 100 plus yards. That's 73% of the time Jonathan Taylor is getting 10 or more fantasy points just off yardage alone. Obviously, he's been playing incredible over the last couple years, but we can't give him all the credit. He's been behind an incredible offensive line. Of course, last season, that was extremely injured. They had 9 different starting offensive line combinations. If you can get into a position in 2022 where that offensive line is far more stable, healthy, the chemistry that they're going to build and the holes that they're going to open for Jonathan Taylor are going to make a huge impact in 2022. Now, while we're on the topic of crediting other people, let's talk about Frank Reich, the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. Since 2018, since he became the head coach, this team has led all teams in the National Football League in terms of running back opportunities. That's a combination of rushing attempts and targets. He is fully bought bought in on the idea that this is a run-first scheme and they're going to give their best player, Jonathan Taylor, the ball on a consistent downly basis. And that's what we've seen over the course of the last 2 seasons. Now you go ahead and you bring in a quarterback by the name of Matt Ryan, a huge improvement in comparison to Carson Wentz of last season. And though Carson Wentz statistically played well, we certainly do believe Matt Ryan is only going to help lead to more red zone opportunities, more touchdowns, and more fantasy points for Jonathan Taylor. Again, throughout the first 2 years of his career, he has yet to miss a game due to injury. He has an extremely high floor, incredible upside, and he's the safest pick to make at the number 1 position because he's an automatic success in 2022. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our next player, beginning the A tier with Christian McCaffrey. For some of you, Christian McCaffrey is a player that you want to avoid. For some of you, you understand the extremely high upside that he presents on a weekly basis. Again, going back to 2019, he broke his own record for most receptions by a running back in a season. He set the record in 2018, broke it in 2019 with 116 receptions. He went ahead and had a year of 1,000 rushing and 1,000 receiving yards. He had a year in fantasy football that was second all-time, only behind LaDainian Tomlinson in terms of total fantasy points at the running back position. Obviously, he had a legendary year in 2019, but since then, in the last 2 years, he's only played 8 full games at the running back position. Yet, throughout that time, he has still been extremely relevant in fantasy football in terms of his fantasy point contributions. In the last 24 games that he has played fully, he is still averaging 24.82 fantasy points per game. He is one of very few running backs that in the league can currently end up producing without even scoring a touchdown. Again, in the last 8 games that Christian McCaffrey has not scored a touchdown, he has still averaged 18.16 half PPR fantasy points per game. That level of production, it really is rare. I don't think Jonathan Taylor could do that. I don't think Derrick Henry can. There's a reason why Christian McCaffrey gets so much notoriety. It's because of what he's been able to accomplish and what we anticipate to see from him in a full healthy season. Now, let's say, for example, we don't see a full healthy season in 2022. Let's say he plays 13 games. At the level in which he's been able to produce over the last 3 years, 24 plus fantasy points in 13 games, this guy is still putting up 320 plus fantasy points, which gets him into the conversation of being a top 3 fantasy back, which is why he's currently here at the start of our A tier. I truly do believe that the injuries that have plagued Christian McCaffrey over the last 2 seasons are behind him. And sure, even if he goes down for a couple weeks, it's not going to stop him from being a top 3 back in 2022. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the only other running back that I personally think can compete with Jonathan Taylor and Christian McCaffrey at the top tier of this list. That is Derrick Henry, running back of the Tennessee Titans. Now, the last time we saw Derrick Henry, in 2021, weeks 1 through 8, the pace that he was setting was unbelievable. This man was averaging 29.9 opportunities per game. Again, opportunities are a combination of targets and total rushing attempts. He was on pace to have career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns in 2021. He was averaging over 24 fantasy points per game. He was an elite machine and was literally carrying fantasy teams to the promised land. Prior to his injury, he had 40 more fantasy points than any other running back in fantasy football. He was separating himself from the pack, and I think he could very easily get back into that conversation in 2022 because of what he's been able to do over the last couple of years. I mean, again, when you look at the time from 2019 through 2021, since Ryan Tannehill has taken the starting running back job for the Tennessee Titans, this man has averaged 21.47 fantasy points per game. Again, that's 33 games in which he's been able to total over 4,000 rushing yards, over 40 total touchdowns. Legendary performances year in and year out from Derrick Henry. He's a special guy. And though many people look at his injury last year and are concerned about potentially seeing another injury in 2022, we have to understand it was a broken foot. He was able to heal. He returned in the playoffs against Cincinnati Bengals, in which he had 20 touches. Again, this is a team that was atop of the AFC, in which they played 9 games without Derrick Henry last year. They have a lot of talent, and they brought in even more this offseason with Austin Hooper, Robert Woods, Treylon Burks, that is only going to help open up the opportunities for Derrick Henry in this offense. And even though teams are going to continue to stack the box, they're going to continue to run the ball and find a lot of success in doing so. Since 2019, the Tennessee Titans have given their running backs the most rushing attempts amongst all teams in the National Football League. It's a pure given. They're going to run the ball. They're going to find success. Now, when you look at the 6 seasons of Derrick Henry's National Football League career, prior to his broken foot, he had only ever missed 2 games due to injury. I think there's a lot of potential for Derrick Henry to continue on. I know he has seen a lot of touches throughout his career, but we all know he's not a normal human. This guy's an alien. He just doesn't fit into the mold of a running back, and we shouldn't treat him as such. That's why We continue to love Derrick Henry and continue to have him amongst the top 3 at the running back position. Moving on, let's talk about our next running back. We have Austin Ekeler beginning our B tier. Now, Austin Ekeler last season was incredible. I mean, this man was averaging 19.3 fantasy points per game. Now, what I've said all offseason is that what Austin Ekeler was able to produce in 2021 was very similar to what Alvin Kamara produced in 2020. And the main correlation between those two was the fact that Joe Lombardi was a part of both offensive schemes. Joe Lombardi became the offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Chargers in 2021. He was a former Saints quarterbacks coach in prior years, learned a lot from what Sean Payton was able to do with Kamara, and implemented that into the Chargers offense in 2021. Now, obviously, the amount of touchdowns, the amount of receiving work that Austin Ekeler was able to obtain certainly got him to this potential, but also the fact that this offense was amongst the top 5 in the league in terms of total yardage, total points per game. We're talking about an elite offense with Justin Herbert leading the way behind a great offensive line. The pieces that they have gone ahead and brought in over the years have only continued to bolster this line. And this offseason, they only went ahead and doubled down by drafting an offensive lineman in the first round of the 2022 NFL Draft. This team is on their way to having another successful year behind Austin Ekeler. And though all of this offseason, we've heard Austin Ekeler come out and say that he wants another running back in this offense to take, some of the pressure off of his back so that he can stay healthy for a full season. We really haven't seen, Isaiah Spiller or Joshua Kelly step up and become that number 2 back for this team. Now, maybe over time throughout the season, we'll see that. But initially, it's going to be all Austin Ekeler all the time, a player that has played out of his mind. And though many of you are expecting some regression in terms of his overall touchdowns, let me just give you these couple stats in terms of what he was able to accomplish last season and why I think it'll once again happen. Considering the fact that they are a part of a top 5 offense, they're going to continue to score and continue to get into red zone opportunities. Last year, Austin Ekeler was the number 2 running back in terms of red zone rushing attempts, 47 that led to 12 touchdowns. He had 12 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. That was 6th amongst all running backs that led to 7 rushing touchdowns. And he was the number 1 running back in terms of total targets last year in the red zone. He had 16 targets that led to 8 total receiving touchdowns. Obviously, Austin Ekeler is a one-of-a-kind running back. We should treat him as such. That is why he's in the top 4 going into 2022. Now, moving on to another B-tier running back, we have Alvin Kamara, the New Orleans Saints running back. In my opinion, going into 2022, you are either fully in or fully out on Alvin Kamara, and I'll tell you exactly why. With the looming potential for a suspension, if Alvin Kamara at any point this season was to be put on the commissioner's exempt list and hit with a suspension of 6+ games, 4+ games, he wouldn't be worth where he is being drafted at this current moment in time. Currently at an ADP of coming off the board, late first, early second rounds, it wouldn't be worth the selection because he would potentially miss upwards of 6 games, which could get him into the conversation of being a top 36 back, but you don't want to be drafting a player with such high risk in your early rounds. So you either believe he is going to be suspended, or you listen to people like an Adam Schefter who say he is less and less likely to be suspended this year and will most likely face that suspension in 2023. And if you are to believe in those statements, then you should be drafting Alvin Kamara as a top tier back because that is what he has been over the years. I mean, you go back to 2020, he was the number 1 running back in fantasy football. And even then, now that we've transitioned to the era without Drew Brees in this lineup, he has still been able to put up incredible production. If you look at the start of the 2021 year, with Jameis Winston under center, Alvin Kamara was averaging 18.08 half PPR fantasy points per game in the 6 games they played together prior to Jameis Winston's season-ending ACL injury. And though the production in the receiving game isn't as high upside as it was with Drew Brees, you're never going to see those kind of numbers, but still, Alvin Kamara was averaging 5.5 targets and 4.17 receptions per game with Jameis Winston under center. I mean, overall, from weeks 1 through 9 of the 2021 season, Alvin Kamara was the number 5 overall back in half PPR. Throughout his career, he has never been anything less than a top 12 back in fantasy football. And I'm starting to think, man, this offense is only improving this offseason. You're bringing in talent like Chris Olave, of course, Jarvis Landry. You're getting Michael Thomas back. You're getting Jameis Winston back, which will only open up the passing game, which will open up running lanes for Alvin Kamara and this offensive line to dominate defenses. There's a lot of potential here, but again, you're either all in or all out on Alvin Kamara. And if you're in, like me, I see him as a top 5 back. Doesn't mean you need to draft him in that regard, but just understand what kind of value he presents on a weekly basis. Moving on, we have Dalvin Cook, running back of the Minnesota Vikings. Again, Dalvin Cook has been incredible over the last couple years. Last season dealt with a little bit of an injury, which knocked him out of being in that top running back contention. But the 2 years prior, 2019 and 2020, this is a top 5 back both seasons. I mean, Dalvin Cook has been incredible. Since 2019, in the games that he has played with Kirk Cousins under center, he's averaged 19.92 fantasy points per game. That's the last 38 games. Overall, he's been amongst the top, whether it is being a goal line back, a player that is touching the ball over 20 times a game, or whether it's being a receiving threat for this offense. He's been able to pretty much do everything for the Minnesota Vikings. And though we have seen that kind of contribution from Dalvin Cook really take a toll on his body, there's a reason why throughout his entire career, he has never been able to play a full season. I think going into 2022, we may see a little bit of a difference here based on the change at the head coaching position and offensive coordinator position. Again, now that we have Kevin O'Connell, the former Los Angeles Rams offensive coordinator, as the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, I'm extremely excited about the potential upside for Dalvin Cook. Again, you have to remember, Kevin O'Connell is bringing in an offensive-minded scheme. He used to be the quarterback's coach of Kirk Cousins back in Washington when they were both there. He is going to be bringing in a Sean McVay approach in which they're going to use Justin Jefferson as this year's Cooper Kupp, which is only going to make it that much more difficult for defenses to stop them on a weekly basis, which will open up more opportunity for Dalvin Cook. Now, obviously, when we approach the potential of drafting Dalvin Cook in any year, we all know that we have to accompany him with Alexander Mattison, whether that is in your 10th or 11th rounds as a handcuff. Alexander Mattison, even in the last 3 years, when he's been given 15 or more opportunities in a game, he's been able to produce over 20 fantasy points per game. So regardless of who's been at the running back position, we've seen a lot of success from Minnesota Vikings running backs over the last couple of years. So I'm confident with that pair leading me to success in 2022. With a massive overhaul as an offense in the scheme, I think Dalvin Cook has a very good opportunity of being in this top conversation. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our C tier of players, beginning with Joe Mixon. I think Joe Mixon is an extremely safe running back because of the amount of touches and opportunity he's going to get in 2022 and the level of production he has shown throughout his entire career. Though many people look at the 2021 season and see, oh man, he was a number 3 overall back in a half PPR scoring format. Mixon is finally becoming what we all thought he would be. I don't really agree with that sentiment. Joe Mixon has been this guy since 2019. If you go back to week 8 of the 2019 season, the reason why I remember it was a Rams game in London. Joe Mixon was finally given the nod by head coach Zach Taylor. He was finally given the, hey, you know what? You're going to be our workhorse back. You're going to be our Todd Gurley. And we're going to, run you into the ground. And hopefully you stay healthy. But either way, you're going to be able to produce a lot of fantasy points. I mean, you go back to 2018. This is the number 9 running back in fantasy. You go back to 2019, number 13 overall running back. You go to 2020, prior to his injury, he was the number 9 running back. Obviously, we all saw this offense take a huge jump in 2021. But the fact that he was able to be a top 10 running back with those terrible Bengals offenses of the past just gives me more confidence in 2022. Again, since week 8 of the 2019 season, he has been averaging 16.42 fantasy points per game and 22.19 touches per game. That level of opportunity is elite. Not only that, you go ahead and have a massive overhaul in terms of the offensive line. 4 new starters in 2021. In terms of free agency, they brought in Ted Karras to play center, Alex Cappa to play the right guard, Lyle Collins to bring in as the right tackle. They drafted a rookie. He's going to win the left guard position. I mean, my goodness. Just imagine what this offense is capable of producing when they protect Joe Burrow and they make it that much more difficult for defenders to stop Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, Hayden Hurst. If they're going to throw the ball as successfully as they did last year, they're going to protect Joe Burrow. I mean, they can't stack the box. Joe Mixon is going to have a field day every time he's out there and hopefully having a lot of fun while he's doing it because I expect him to have a fantastic 2022 year. Moving on to Najee Harris, the final player of our C tier. Najee Harris is another one of these running backs that I'm extremely excited about. Obviously, losing Big Ben Roethlisberger leaves a little bit of uncertainty as to where this offense is leading, whether or not it is going to be Mitchell Trubisky or Kenny Pickett. Those are the questions that many of us are, currently contemplating, and whether that's going to make a big enough difference on the impact of the rushing game. Now, what I want to first and foremost say is when we've looked at the last 3 years in which games that Ben Roethlisberger has been injured and not played, the running back position has averaged 2.5 more fantasy points per game for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now you have Matt Canada with a potential mobile quarterback, whether that is Trubisky or Pickett. They're going to run more RPOs. They're going to bring in more of a college scheme that is only going to help running the ball. They've gone ahead. They've made some huge improvements in terms of offensive line this offseason, bringing in a new center and right guard, re-signing their right tackle, which is only going to help in terms of the long run. Now, a player like Najee Harris is special. Last season, he played the most snaps amongst all running backs in the National Football League. Again, he played 86% of the Steelers' offensive snaps, and he handled 86% of the Steelers' backfield opportunity. When you're getting a bunch of receptions out of the backfield, you're getting all that work on the ground. We're in line for Najee Harris potentially getting to a 400 touch season. And regardless of how effective he is with those touches, the volume of opportunity is only going to continue to solidify his floor of production every single week. Now, when we look at the history at the running back position since 2016, running backs that have come into their rookie year and been top 6 fantasy backs in their following season have always been able to be a top 12 back once again. So I'm certainly expecting an RB1 performance out of Najee Harris this season. But again, because of all the touches he is granted from the Pittsburgh Steelers offense, it makes him one of those safe plays. A guy that at the back end of your first round, you know is going to get weekly touches, which is only going to solidify their overall fantasy point production. All right, moving on to our D tier. We begin with Saquon Barkley. Man, I'm extremely excited about the potential of Saquon Barkley. He has had a couple quotes this offseason that gives me so much excitement because we're potentially getting back to what Saquon Barkley looked like in 2018, 2019. If you guys don't remember, in the first 2 years of his career, this guy in 28 games was averaging 19.74 fantasy points per game, was an elite level talent, and obviously tore his ACL. And last year, obviously, was kind of going through it, was trying to trust his knee, was trying to get into a position where he could finally, get back into this offense and feel comfortable. Then he got hit with an ankle injury. That thing ballooned up, missed a lot of time. He came back and wasn't himself. But this offseason, we've heard all the right things from Saquon Barkley. He is saying things like, I'm trusting my knee again. I feel like I'm better than ever. When Saquon Barkley is in a position to where he's more confident now than he's ever been with his knee, with his ability, the fact that this offensive line has been, completely renovated. You bring in Andrew Thomas a couple years ago. He's become an elite left tackle. You bring in Evan Neal at the right tackle position. They've gone ahead and brought in a guard from the Indianapolis Colts to play right guard. You bring in a center from the Bills, again, with Brian Daboll. Again, for those of you who aren't familiar who Brian Daboll is, he's currently the new head coach of the New York Giants, the former offensive coordinator who helped unlock Josh Allen to what he is today. If Daboll is able to do just a little bit of that with Daniel Jones, this offense is only going to open up and make more and more opportunities to score and lead to a lot of success for Saquon Barkley. Moving on to DeAndre Swift, another one of these running backs that is on the up and up. After the first 2 seasons of his career, has had a lot of hype this offseason, and it's not by accident. You saw what he was able to accomplish last season. From weeks 1 through 11 prior to his injury, he was averaging 15.8 fantasy points per game. He was a number 7 overall running back throughout that span of time. Now, going into 2022, of course, we have an elite level offensive line here. According to Pro Football Focus, they're a top 5 run blocking offensive line in the National Football League. So if they're able to stay healthy, DeAndre Swift is only going to get that much more opportunity to run the ball because that's where they kind of shifted towards late last season. If you guys remember, at the beginning of the 2021 year, Anthony Lynn was the play caller for this team and the offensive coordinator. They began to shift away from him and give those play calling responsibilities to their head coach, Dan Campbell, in which he continued to run the ball, and that's what they're going to continue to do. They want to run the ball. They want to bite kneecaps. They want to be a team that dictates game from the trenches. And with DeAndre Swift as their starting back, and their best player on their offense, they're going to give him every single opportunity to succeed in 2022. I believe DeAndre Swift's ability as a runner has him in line for a pretty solid floor of production, but his overall receiving work is going to get him into that conversation of being this upcoming year's Austin Ekeler. What Austin Ekeler was last year, a late first round pick, a guy that we weren't 100% sure on, and it ended up exploding to being a top 2 NFL running back in terms of fantasy football. DeAndre Swift has that capability, and we'll have that opportunity this year. It's only a matter of whether or not he takes that opportunity and runs away with it. All right, moving on to our next running back, we have Aaron Jones, running back of the Green Bay Packers. Now, Aaron Jones is in a very interesting scenario. Again, this is a player that over the last 3 years has been a top 12 fantasy running back. He's been able to put up numbers at minimum of 1,100 total yards, 10 touchdowns, and 47 receptions over the last 3 seasons. Now, again, Throughout that span of time, in the 45 games he has played, he's been averaging 16.19 fantasy points per game and has scored 40 touchdowns in those 45 games. Now, going into 2022, the entire conversation regarding the Green Bay Packers has typically been, hey, what are they going to look like without Davante Adams? Are they going to be the same offense? Can they still find that level of success? And we all believe that that's going to be the case. Now, Aaron Jones, in the 8 games that he has played without Davante Adams in the lineup since 2019, or games in which Davante Adams left the game early due to injury, Aaron Jones was an unstoppable force in those contests, averaging 25.68 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format while only playing 60% of the offensive snaps. Now, I know the conversation this offseason has revolved around, hey, is A.J. Dillon going to get more and more of an opportunity? Matt LaFleur has come out and said, we have 2 1A running backs. We have a 2-headed monster that is just going to take over. And I believe them in that regard. But as long as Aaron Jones is getting his 60% of his overall offensive snaps and continues to lead in that direction in terms of being the leading receiver of this team. Again, if you look at the offense as a whole from 2019 through 2021, Aaron Jones has had the second most targets and receptions over the last 3 years, only behind Davante Adams. And there have been receivers in this offense like a Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Equanimeous St. Brown, Allen Lazard, who have all contested for that, but have not been able to keep up with Aaron Jones. He's a guy that's going to be one of Aaron Rodgers' main targets on a weekly basis. And regardless of how much opportunity they continue to give towards A.J. Dillon, Jones has just got himself a solidified position as he's got touchdown upside, he's going to get that rushing work, and the receiving game is only going to take him over the top. Moving on, we have Leonard Fournette, who's in a very similar position, a running back within a top-tier offense that is going to continue to get a lot of receiving work. Now, again, when you look back at 2021, between weeks 4 through 14, this team finally fully bought back into the idea of playoff Lenny. In that 2020 playoff run, he was incredible. But at the beginning of the 2021 year, they were using a lot of Ronald Jones. They were using a lot of Giovanni Bernard. And then they finally came to their senses and were like, why aren't we using our best running back? Why aren't we using playoff Lenny? And that's what they did. From weeks 4 through 14, throughout that 10-game span, he was averaging 18.8 fantasy points. He had 63 targets and 50 receptions in those 10 games. Again, when you're averaging 5 catches a game at the running back position, that is elite, especially when you're in comparison to guys like Austin Ekeler and Alvin Kamara, who aren't even able to get those numbers. We have seen Tom Brady love to pass the ball to his respective running backs in seasons past. You go back to the Patriot days with James White, 86, 72, 123, 95. Those are the total target counts over the last 4 years that Brady played in New England. And not only even that, we talk about Bruce Arians, Byron Leftwich, their days back with the Arizona Cardinals. We all remember David Johnson in 2016, 120 total targets, 80 receptions, having an incredible year as the number 1 overall fantasy running back. This team wants to get their running backs involved in terms of the receiving game. We expect to see that from Leonard Fournette. Now, the biggest concern about Fournette has always been health. He's never played a full healthy season in his career. And despite that, I still think the fact that he is associated with a top-tier offense, he is associated with Tom Brady, who is only just setting career highs in his 20th year in the National Football League. We are in a fantastic position, and I understand there have been some offensive line concerns in terms of injuries, and that is what kind of has led me to pushing Leonard Fournette lower on this overall tier list. But ultimately, he's still a top 12 back in my eyes and should be drafted as such. All right, let's get into the E tier, beginning with Nick Chubb. Now, first and foremost, when we talk about Nick Chubb, we have to compare a couple things. First and foremost, with and without Kareem Hunt, because we've heard a lot of conversations this offseason, potentially with Kareem Hunt being traded. He said, hey, listen, I need a new contract. I need, to either have a little bit of security in my future, or you guys got to move on from me. Now, if in fact they do move on from Kareem Hunt and they do trade him in the coming weeks here, I mean, holy moly, Nick Chubb would jump in my rankings. He would go from being a top 13 back to really being in that top 8 conversation because of what he's done over the years. Again, in the last 5 games in which Kareem Hunt has not been active, has left due to injury, anything of that exchange, Nick Chubb has averaged 19.96 fantasy points per game in a half PPR. Now, in the 18 other games over the last 2 seasons where Kareem Hunt has been active, Nick Chubb is still averaging 16.03 fantasy points per game. So with or without, obviously there's a 4-point swing in terms of fantasy point production, but still, this is an offense that has ran the ball just about as much as anybody in the National Football League. They've given their running backs the 3rd most rushing attempts since 2020, since Kevin Stefanski became the offensive coordinator of this team. It has been a run-first approach behind a top-tier run blocking offensive line. Again, when you have guards like Teller and Bitonio, they're just going to continue to maul defenses. You have Conklin at the right tackle. I mean, this is an offensive line that is dictating games and is going to determine their potential success in 2022. Now, obviously, there's a lot of conversations as to whether Jacoby Brissett is going to be able to lead this offense to a successful point. I think their strength of schedule early on, if you guys haven't checked out my strength of schedule video, be sure to do so today. The strength of schedule from the first 7 weeks of the season is extremely advantageous for Nick Chubb. It gets far more difficult near the fantasy playoffs, but at that point in time, they should have Deshaun Watson back, which should only elevate this offense as a whole because they'll have more opportunities in the red zone in comparison to the quarterback play of Jacoby Brissett. But when I think of an injured Baker Mayfield in comparison to a fully healthy Jacoby Brissett, they're relatively similar in my eyes. One quarterback was suffering and barely able to throw the ball because of the pain that he was in, and the other one is going to be fully healthy, and I think they're relatively equals. That tells you how much confidence I have in a guy like Baker Mayfield, but it also should explain to you how much success we should see from this backfield and Nick Chubb in 2022. Moving on, we have Javonte Williams as our next player of the E tier. Look, over the last couple weeks, we have heard a lot of statements made from the team, specifically Melvin Gordon, that has given me the confidence to move Javonte Williams in this position. Gordon, in an interview with the media, said that the head coach, the offensive coordinator, they all want Javonte Williams to be quote-unquote the guy. Now, let me explain to you exactly what that means. When you look at the new head coach of this team, Nathaniel Hackett, he was the former offensive coordinator of Green Bay between 2019 and 2021. The Green Bay Packers, since 2019, have given their running backs top 10 numbers in terms of total running back opportunity and rushing attempts. In seasons prior, when Nathaniel Hackett was with the Jacksonville Jaguars as their offensive coordinator, was the exact same 500 opportunities per year from 2016 through 2018 for those running backs. And even when you go back to the days from 2013 through 2014 with the Buffalo Bills, same status. They continue to give their running backs the ball, which is what we expect from Javonte Williams. He is going to be the Aaron Jones of this offense, while Melvin Gordon will be a lesser end A.J. Dillon. And if you're going to give Javonte Williams the ball a bunch of times in the receiving game, if you're going to give him those red zone rushing attempts, again, this is an offense that is elevated due to the fact that you're bringing in Russell Wilson, which is only going to lead to more touchdowns, more opportunities in the red zone. I mean, the last time we saw Javonte Williams be quote-unquote the guy was a game in which Melvin Gordon wasn't active. It was 2021. It was against the Chiefs late in the season. Javonte Williams in that game was an absolute machine, and he scored 26.8 total fantasy points in that contest. If we're getting closer to that conversation, if we're getting a 60-40 split in which Javonte Williams is going to be dominating this backfield and getting the wide majority of opportunities, he deserves to be in this conversation, and that's why I have him here as such. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott. Now, Zeke has kind of dipped over the last couple days because of some circumstances. First and foremost, the fact that Tyron Smith is going to be out with an injury until December. And maybe if he has any complications, he may be out for the full year. That is a all-pro left tackle. That is the second best, if not the best offensive lineman on this team. And I do want to give credit to Zach Martin, the right guard. He is still one of the best guards in the league, but Tyron Smith is a leader. He is a huge part of the success of this offense as a whole, whether it is passing or running the ball. And the fact that they won't have him is certainly going to play a huge part in the success of Zeke and what we see in 2022. That being said, Zeke has still been an extremely consistent running back throughout his career. In the first 6 seasons of his career, he's always been an RB1. He has put up a minimum of 1,250 rushing yards and 8 touchdowns total each of those 6 consecutive years. He has had 47 plus receptions in 4 consecutive seasons when we look back from 2018 through 2021. Zeke has obviously shown us that he is a top-tier running back in seasons past. I mean, the fact that he's been able to stay on the field as long as he has. He's only missed 1 game in his career due to injuries. And when I say that, I don't count week 17 games in which, this team was already in the playoffs or didn't want to use Zeke because they knew, hey, we're not making the playoffs, so why use our running back? So when we take those out of the conversation because they weren't due to injury, only missing 1 game due to injury, considering he had a partially torn PCL last season, my goodness, Zeke is a tough son of a gun. And going into 2022, he's going to be the main focal point of this offense. I mean, we have heard Jerry Jones in the last couple weeks say, where Zeke goes, we go. He's going to be the main focus of this offense. And yes, Pollard is going to be utilized, but Zeke is our primary offensive threat. And that's pretty much, going to have to be the case. when you don't have an Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup to start the season, when you lose James Washington, when you really only have CeeDee Lamb, Dalton Schultz, Ezekiel Elliott as your primary offensive threats, the running game is going to have to be extremely vital in the overall success for the Dallas Cowboys. So they're going to run him into the ground. Now, whether that leads to lower levels of efficiency or production from Ezekiel Elliott, I don't think they care. I mean, they paid him a lot of money, and they're going to give him, upwards of 280 touches this year, which is only going to solidify his base floor of production. The fact that you're the lead back, you're the goal line back of an offense like the Dallas Cowboys, who were at the top of the league last season, obviously will take some steps back because they're missing so many pieces in 2021. But either way, with that level of potential production, I have a lot of confidence in Zeke in 2022. Moving on to our next running back, we have James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, James Conner last year was one of those surprising players that came out of absolutely nowhere. He was a player that we all monitored, but we all thought his final years at the Pittsburgh Steelers were, purely what we were to potentially expect. A guy that couldn't stay healthy, a player that, yes, was good when given opportunity, but wasn't able to just stay on the field, which was such a rough thing to see considering how much talent that he had. But in 2021, James Conner defied all the odds. He was able to eventually win the starting job and just be a complete monster on the ground, scoring 18 total touchdowns in his 2021 campaign. In games last season where James Conner had no Chase Edmonds in the lineup, Edmonds had been injured. In those 6 contests, James Conner just elevated to another level, putting up 21.67 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR scoring format. Again, now you go into 2022 and you have no Chase Edmonds on the team. He is on the Miami Dolphins. They signed Darrell Williams, but all the rumors we're hearing is that Darrell Williams is going to be potentially a guy that they're cutting this offseason prior to the year beginning. If you're going to have James Conner at a full capacity with the goal line opportunity, with the rushing attempts and the receiving work on hand in an Arizona Cardinals offense that should be amongst the best in the National Football League, I mean, James Conner should be higher than he's currently ranked. But again, the reason why we worry about James Conner is because of touchdown upside. You look at his rushing total, his rushing efficiency last year. It wasn't great. And if you're not going to see him score 18 touchdowns, he'll score 10 this year, for example. That is going to take off a lot of points in terms of his overall production, which is pretty much where I see him landing. I still see this guy scoring 10 touchdowns. Now, for those of you who contest the idea that he could potentially score 10 touchdowns in 2022, let me explain to you exactly why I have confidence in that matter. Obviously, last year, he was second amongst all running backs in total red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. He had 16 attempts that led to 10 rushing touchdowns. But this isn't something new that the Arizona Cardinals have done. You go back to 2020 with Kenyon Drake as their starting running back. Kenyon Drake that year had the 3rd most rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line amongst all running backs. 21 rushing attempts for 9 rushing touchdowns. This team finds a lot of success. They get down to the goal line. They use the ability of Kyler Murray's threat as a runner to stop backside defensive ends from being able to crash down and stop these running backs from scoring. I think James Conner is in line for a lot of opportunity this year, should be scoring those touchdowns and being a fantastic fantasy back. All right, that'll close out our E tier players. We're moving on to our F tier, beginning with Josh Jacobs. And like I mentioned before, though these are players in the F tier, they're still going to be players that are in my top 24 running back ranking. So don't let the F tier fool you. Josh Jacobs has been an extremely consistent fantasy running back and should be treated as such going into 2022, especially considering the fact that this team plans on cutting Kenyon Drake in the coming days. Again, when you look at what Josh Jacobs has been able to produce in his career, his rookie season was the number 18 overall running back. And you maybe think, okay, that's a rookie year. The following year in 2020 was the number 8 overall running back. Last season was the number 14 overall running back. But if you purely isolate when he has been healthy and at a full capacity, Josh Jacobs has been a top 12 back every year. Let's talk about this. His rookie year, weeks 1 through 15, prior to the injury that ended his season, he was the number 11 overall running back in fantasy, averaging 13.97 fantasy points per game. In 2020, didn't deal with an injury and was the number 8 overall back with 14.32 fantasy points per game. In 2021, when you look at his overall production between weeks 4 through 18, of course, from the first 3 weeks of the season was dealing with that turf toe injury that really bothered him and prevented him from being on the field at all times. So after that, after he recovered from that, from weeks 4 through 18 was the number 7 overall running back in fantasy football, averaging 13.04 fantasy points per game. Now, you go into 2022 with Josh McDaniels as the head coach of this team. If you guys remember, over the last 5 seasons, The New England Patriots have led all teams in terms of running back opportunities. They've given their running backs the most total rushing attempts plus targets in the entire league. And again, it's not really a surprise. You look at last season, you look at seasons prior, they have had multiple running backs that have found a lot of success in the National Football League, and they're going to continue to run the ball in 2022 with the Las Vegas Raiders. You have an offense that has Devontae Adams, Hunter Renfrow, Darren Waller. It is going to be extremely difficult to stack the box. And Josh McDaniels, he doesn't get bored of running the ball. He's going to continue to pound the rock. And Josh Jacobs, going into the final year of his contract with the Raiders, he's trying to earn it. He's going to go out there and he is going to be the primary back of this offense. I know a lot of whispers regarding Zamir White, his potential of taking some touches. He's going to take some touches. That's a given. But he's not going to be the goal line back of this team. And when this team is just dominating teams because of how much success they can find in the receiving game, just imagine how much red zone opportunity Josh Jacobs will end up seeing in 2022. All right, moving on to our next running back. We have David Montgomery of the Chicago Bears. Now, David Montgomery is in a very interesting situation. Obviously, you have a bad offensive line. According to Pro Football Focus, in terms of run blocking grades, they have the third worst offensive line in the National Football League going into this year. On top of that, you have a young quarterback that is still trying to learn, who is going to take away some red zone rushing attempts. He's going to have some, running ability that may reduce the overall receiving work of a David Montgomery, but these are things that I'm still not too worried about. I look at David Montgomery and I think to myself, man, this has still been a very successful back despite being in one of the worst offenses in the National Football League over the last couple of years. Whether it is with, Andy Dalton, Mitchell Trubisky, it hasn't really mattered. There's been a lot of success from David Montgomery. When we go back to week 12 of the 2020 season, since then, David Montgomery has been averaging 16.71 fantasy points per game. In the last 19 games, has put up 15 total touchdowns. 13 of those 19 games playing 70+% of the offensive snaps. Now, I know there's a conversation as to whether or not Khalil Herbert will be threatening some of the overall potential of Montgomery. Sure, Khalil Herbert is going to get some touches, but there's a reason why Khalil Herbert couldn't get into that conversation last year. I mean, you look at weeks 1 through 4 for David Montgomery in 2021. He was the number 10 overall running back prior to his injury. After he came back from his injury, weeks 9 through 18, he was the number 11 overall running back in fantasy football. He has consistently been a great overall player, and despite being in a terrible offense over the last couple of seasons, we're going to see that same terrible offense in 2022. So there really isn't much of a change. The biggest reason why I have so much confidence in David Montgomery is just volume of opportunity. A lot of other running backs aren't going to see as much rushing attempts and targets that lead to receptions in 2022. And because of that volume, it's always going to eventually lead to success. These are professionals. They're going to score points. They're going to score touchdowns. And when they do, David Montgomery will be helping your fantasy teams. Moving on, we have Travis Etienne for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, Etienne has had one of the most decorated NCAA careers at the running back position. I mean, the stats that he came out of college with, 4,900 rushing yards, over 78 touchdowns, over 100 catches, over 1,000 receiving yards at the running back position. There's a lot to be excited about when it comes to Travis Etienne, especially considering his quarterback from college, Trevor Lawrence, is his quarterback in the National Football League. You have that rapport already built in. The amount of receiving work he was able to get in college will only continue to develop at the pro level. You bring in Doug Peterson, which is a huge upgrade from what Urban Meyer was setting this team up with last season. The offense is going to evolve. They're going to help this young quarterback continue to take steps forward, unlike last season, which he was taking steps backwards. I think Travis Etienne is going to be a huge part of this offense, mainly because, again, James Robinson, sure, is coming back from that Achilles injury, but how much potential impact can we see? If James Robinson shows up, is the early down back, is the goal line back, it's all over. Travis Etienne's season is pretty much a wash because regardless of how efficient James Robinson is, if Doug Peterson believes in a guy, he is going to run him out there every single time. Now, we got to hope we get into a position where Doug Peterson is in love with the potential of a Travis Etienne, the versatility of what he could present on a daily basis, which I'm hoping is going to be the case. When I look at Travis Etienne, I've said this multiple times this offseason, Etienne is what DeAndre Swift was last season, a player that is in this middle of the pack RB2 conversation that has extremely high upside. And if he's able to get the receiving work and score touchdowns, he's going to be able to blow past that and potentially get into that top 12 conversation. We have seen running backs over the last couple of years. You go back to 2019, Leonard Fournette, 2020, James Robinson, from the Jaguars be top 12 running backs. Why not Travis Etienne? I think there's a very good argument for it. That's why we're investing in him in 2022. Moving on to Cam Akers. Now, speaking of Achilles injuries, again, we were talking about James Robinson. Let's talk about the potential of Cam Akers in 2022. Again, Cam Akers, he's about 13 months removed from that injury. He sustained that, season-ending, quote-unquote, injury to his Achilles last July. Obviously, we saw him participate in the NFL playoffs. And though he was extremely inefficient, despite all of the facts that are laid out in terms of the missed tackles forced per game, the inability to be able to read and have burst with his steps, I understand it. We all witnessed it. I'm a Rams fan. There's a reason why I understand these things. But we have to take into account what exactly we witnessed. Not only do we witness terrible play from Cam Akers, but we witnessed Sean McVay commit to him regardless of the fact. If you go back to Cam Akers' rookie year, they were waiting to give him the reins to this offense. They were waiting to give him the number one RB opportunity. In 2020, from weeks 13 through the NFL playoffs, he was averaging 23.83 touches per game and 15.72 half PPR fantasy points per game while playing 72% of the offensive snaps. They want him to be the lead back, and that's exactly what they showed to us in the NFL playoffs. Despite the fact that they had a healthy Sony Michel and Darrell Henderson, they continue to go back to the guy who was only 6 months removed from his Achilles injury, because that's who they want to be their guy. And though all this offseason we've heard, Darrell Henderson is also the number one running back on the depth chart as Cam Akers. They're going to run a two-headed monster. That's not, Sean McVay's MO. He talks a lot of game about using multiple backs, but when it comes down to it, he uses one. I mean, you go back to last year. You look at weeks 1 through 12. Darrell Henderson was the primary back. He was averaging over 14 fantasy points per game. And then all of a sudden, it was Sony Michel. And for the rest of that year, during the regular season, Sony Michel was the lead back, averaging over 13 fantasy points per game. If you go ahead and combine both Sony Michel and Darrell Henderson's production last year, we have a running back that was averaging over 21 rushing attempts and 4.29 targets per game with 16.74 fantasy points per game. There's a lot of potential here for Cam Akers. Let's not forget, prior to his Achilles injury, this is a guy that was a late first, early second round pick based on the opportunity of production and the offense he's associated with. That offense has elevated in the last year with Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp going off, bringing in Allen Robinson, maybe getting OBJ midway through. I mean, Cam Akers has a lot of upside. Obviously a lot of risk, but we're willing to take that at his current draft position. Moving on to J.K. Dobbins. Speaking of a lot of risk at the current draft position, J.K. Dobbins in 2021 obviously sustained that brutal season-ending ACL injury in the preseason. But prior to that, again, was another one of these running backs that had an incredible late 2020 year. Through weeks 11 through 17 of the 2020 season, J.K. Dobbins was the number 8 overall running back in terms of total fantasy points, averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game through a 6-game stretch. Throughout that time, he had scored a touchdown in 6 consecutive games. The production level that we saw from J.K. Dobbins was elite. And obviously, when you're associated with an offense and an offensive line that wants to run the ball as much as they do with the way that this offense has kind of been built around Lamar Jackson, the rushing threat for the Baltimore Ravens is amongst the top of the National Football League. I mean, since 2019, since Lamar became the starting quarterback of this team, they've given their running backs the 12th most rushing attempts amongst all teams in the National Football League. And really, the level of production we have seen from running backs from this team in 2019, in 2020, has been top tier. In those years, at a minimum, we have seen 2,200 rushing yards from running backs and 17 total touchdowns. Now, obviously, this last season, when you have no Gus Edwards, you have no J.K. Dobbins, and you have Devontae Freeman and Latavius Murray as your starting running backs, you're going to see a pretty, big dip in terms of overall productivity, especially once Lamar Jackson gets injured himself and leaves the lineup. But overall, we're talking about a top-tier offensive threat in terms of running the ball, a team that is going to continue to be amongst the top 5 in those categories. And yes, you have Gus Edwards on the pup. You still have the looming threat of a Mike Davis. But hey, if you're going to tell me that J.K. Dobbins can't beat out Mike Davis, then I deserve to lose my fantasy league. Overall, I think the ACL injury is just a matter of whether or not he can trust his knee sooner rather than later. And if he's able to do so with the strength of schedule they have early on in the season, there's a lot of potential for J.K. Dobbins. And though, yes, Lamar Jackson has been a running back that over the course of the last 3 seasons has stolen a lot of touchdowns. He has scored 10 rushing touchdowns inside the 10-yard line since 2019. And though he has shown that he doesn't like to target running backs that often, last year was setting career highs in terms of per game averages, in terms of targeting the running back position. If those numbers continue to increase, there's a lot of potential for J.K. Dobbins in 2022. Moving on to Breece Hall, the final running back of our F tier. Now, this is the first rookie that we're talking about. He was a second-round selection in the 2022 NFL Draft. And the reason why I say this is because when we look at the history at the running back position over the last couple years, we've seen a lot of production out of second-round running backs. Since 2017, there have been 13 running backs selected in the second round. 10 of those running backs didn't deal with massive injuries. The 3 that did, Dalvin Cook, Darius Geis, and Ronald Jones in their rookie years. Of the 10 running backs that remained, 8 of them were top 36 players, 6 of them top 24 running backs, and 1 of them was a top 12 running back, that being Jonathan Taylor. Now, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we have heard many conversations regarding Michael Carter still being the RB1 of this team. Michael Carter still being given, the first crack at it. I believe that over the course of this season, Michael Carter will get those touches, but eventually Breece Hall is going to prove to everyone why they drafted him in the second round. Again, let's not forget, they traded up 2 picks to ensure that they got Breece Hall. They wanted their guy, and they're going to exactly utilize him as such. Eventually, he's going to be the workhorse running back of this team behind a pretty solid offensive line. With Joe Flacco being the quarterback for the first couple weeks, I anticipate a lot of receiving work for a running back like Breece Hall. We've looked at the course of Joe Flacco's entire career. He loves to check it down, whether it was with Kyle Juszczyk, Danny Woodhead. If you go back to even last season, we've seen a lot of utilization from those running backs in the receiving game, which is only going to help increase the production of Breece Hall, even if he's not given majority of the rushing work early on. A running back that I'm trusting to have a lot of production and a lot of upside in 2022. All right, talking about another running back here, let's talk about Damien Harris, beginning our G tier. Again, Damien Harris, he's being slept on, but not by accident. I understand that there's a lot of concern about a running back who's not going to be involved in the receiving game. You talk about Cam Akers, you talk about J.K. Dobbins, they're in similar positions, but the reason why Damien Harris is here is because the other day he did sustain an injury which forced him to leave practice, and he did not return. That in itself gives me some concern. Now, by the time we get to the season, rankings are subject to change. He could move up this list because he was higher this offseason based on what he was able to do last year. In 2021, weeks 6 through 18, he was the number 7 overall running back in fantasy, averaging 16.2 half PPR fantasy points per game throughout a 10-game span. Throughout that span of time, he only played 41.12% of the offensive snaps. And the reason why he was able to find so much success was because they were giving him the ball on the ground, and especially near the goal line. Last season, he ranked 4th amongst all running backs in terms of red zone rushing attempts, 44 attempts inside the red zone for 11 rushing touchdowns. He was 3rd amongst all running backs in terms of red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, only behind guys like Jonathan Taylor and, James Conner. He had 14 attempts for 9 touchdowns. Now, obviously, over the course of the last 5 seasons, like I mentioned with Josh Jacobs, the player that literally sits above him here on our tier list, over the course of the last 5 seasons, we've seen Josh McDaniels lead this team in terms of giving their running backs the most opportunities amongst all teams in the National Football League. Now, you're going to get an offensive coordinator change. You're going to get a bit of a change as an offense as a whole. You have, Matt Patricia and Joe Judge leading the way. I mean, if anything, they're just going to run the ball, and they're going to find success doing so. Passing the ball, I don't know how that entire scheme is going to work. That may make it more difficult to run the ball, and the emergence of a Rhamondre Stevenson and his potential may make it more difficult, but I still think that Damien Harris is a great investment based on where he's being drafted and the amount of potential he has to being another one of these guys that can run for, 900, 1,000 rushing yards and 10-plus touchdowns. And if he's able to do so once again, the amount of production he's presenting to you based on his overall ADP, it's just far too valuable to give up on. Moving on to Elijah Mitchell. All right, Elijah Mitchell is another one of these running backs that has had workhorse level opportunity. And you don't really see that often, especially in a rookie. Last season, while everyone was thinking whether it was going to be Raheem Mostert or Trey Sermon, pretty much all of us were unaware of the fact that Elijah Mitchell was that next man up. And he stepped up and played incredible. In the 11 games that he played last season, he averaged 14.14 fantasy points per game while averaging 20.55 touches per game. Again, that's elite level opportunity. Now, one of the most interesting stats that I found regarding Elijah Mitchell this offseason was that if in fact he was to play a full 17-game season in 2021, stay fully healthy, and not deal with all those nagging injuries, the guy would have been the number 5 overall running back in fantasy in terms of total fantasy points. That's what kind of level of production he was at last season, behind one of the better offensive lines in the league, in a Kyle Shanahan offense that has been in the top 10 conversation of running back opportunities over the last 3+ years. I mean, we are in, the perfect offense for a potential workhorse back. But going into 2022, There are conversations regarding Trey Lance and his rushing ability. In the 2 starts that Trey Lance had, the guy had 24 rushing attempts. When you're going to go ahead and siphon 10 plus rushing attempts away from this running back, especially considering the fact that there are other running backs in this backfield, Jeff Wilson Jr., Trey Sermon, Tyrion Davis-Price, you're bringing in other threats that are going to potentially make a committee situation. The fact that the 49ers were at the very bottom of the list in terms of running back fantasy points contributed from receiving work. Again, they don't use their running backs very often in the receiving game. When you have a mobile quarterback, those numbers are obviously going to diminish because instead of checking it down because of a lack of mobility, he's going to get running and finding first downs with his legs. I think that there is a lot to like about Elijah Mitchell, but there's also a lot of situations here, whether it's also even Deebo Samuel getting more rushing attempts in this offense that could take away from Elijah Mitchell's overall upside. I still think he's a top 24 running back, but you have to keep an eye on his potential considering all of the other looming threats in this offense taking away value. All right, let's move on to Kareem Hunt. Now, if in fact Kareem Hunt stays with the Cleveland Browns this season, it's pretty much the entire same argument that I made for, Nick Chubb. We're talking about an extremely talented back that has found a lot of success in this offense. I mean, if you look at just his entire career as a whole, Kareem Hunt has always been a top 10 fantasy running back, except for the years that he has missed significant time. So besides the suspension year, the first year with the Cleveland Browns, and last season, where he dealt with a huge injury that made him miss a significant amount of time, he's always been a top 10 running back in fantasy football. I mean, look at weeks 1 through 5 of the 2021 year. He was averaging 16.98 fantasy points per game in that 5-game span and was the number 5 overall running back in fantasy football. In an offense that is going to have to run the ball with Jacoby Brissett at the quarterback position behind a top-tier offensive line, I mean, when we look at the last 2 seasons with Nick Chubb in the lineup, Kareem Hunt is averaging 13.24 fantasy points per game in 17 games. If there's an incoming trade, if they move him to another team, he's still going to have a lot of value because he's an elite level talent at the running back position. A guy that is able to do it on the ground, on the goal line, and in the receiving game. But if you leave him in this offense, sure, it's going to diminish some of the value of a Nick Chubb, which we've already taken into account, but it's also going to still present Kareem Hunt as a top 25 running back option in 2022. All right, moving on. We have A.J. Dillon. Again, another one of these running backs that is in an elite offense that loves to run the ball and is going to be given a lot of opportunity. And we heard it this offseason. We've heard Matt LaFleur come out and say we have 2 1A options. We have 2 guys that we are confident in as our number 1 running back, and we're going to use them as such. That's fantastic, especially considering what we saw from A.J. Dillon late last season. The fact that he had, 221 total touches, had himself 30 receptions. That level of production will only continue to build in 2022, assuming A.J. Dillon splits touches with Aaron Jones. Now, if that is the assumption, then A.J. Dillon should probably be higher on this list. But if he is going to play the role that I anticipate him playing in, where we're going to see 60% of the snaps go to Aaron Jones and 40% go to A.J. Dillon, he's still going to get his touches, but it's going to be about 13 to 14 a game in comparison to 16, 17, which in the long run will make a difference, but ultimately still has him in the conversation of potentially being a top 24 back in 2022. Now let's get into that conversation. How often have we seen an offense produce 2 top 24 running backs? Well, over the course of the last 5 seasons, and this really does apply for Kareem Hunt as well. Over the course of the last 5 seasons, there have been 9 teams that have produced 2 top 24 half PPR running backs. 8 of those 9 teams have been in the conversation of giving their running backs top 10 total running back opportunity in those given seasons. The Cleveland Browns, the Green Bay Packers, they all check the boxes. And there's a reason why in 2021, Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon were able to accomplish that. And in 2020, Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb were able to accomplish that. There's a lot of potential here. We've talked about it in terms of how many points running backs for the Green Bay Packers have scored without Davante Adams in the lineup. We talked about how Aaron Jones early on today's episode in those 8 games was averaging over 25 fantasy points per game. But as the entire running back position as a whole, when Davante Adams has missed games over the last 3 years, that running back position for the Green Bay Packers has averaged 38.33 fantasy points per game without Davante Adams in it. So even if we allocate those 25 points to Aaron Jones, let's say he's able to put up those crazy numbers. We're talking about 13 fantasy points upwards of that number for A.J. Dillon. Obviously, those are inflated numbers based on the circumstances of those games. But hey, I think A.J. Dillon has a lot of potential in 2022. Moving on to Rashaad Penny. All right, Penny's a very interesting running back. Listen, I know he won many of us fantasy championships last year. Weeks 14 through 18 was averaging 21.54 fantasy points per game and was putting up numbers that really we expected to see early on in his career, but got derailed due to injuries and the ACL and all of that. But last season, he was number one amongst all running backs in yards per carry, averaging 6.3 with a minimum of 100 rushing attempts. He also was leading all running backs in the National Football League last year with 4.52 yards per carry after contact. Again, you have to take into account that there were running backs last year that were averaging less than 4 yards per carry. This guy was averaging more yards per carry after contact last season. Now, obviously, the offensive changes going into 2022 are going to make a huge difference. Offensive line will take a couple steps back. Offense as a whole will take some steps back because of the fact that they don't have Russell Wilson there. What are they going to do with Geno Smith, Drew Lock? Are they going to be enough to help Rashaad Penny develop into the running back we expect him to be? But with all of that taken into consideration and being questioned, the biggest factor as to whether or not Rashaad Penny will succeed this year is his potential health. Over the course of the first 4 seasons of his career, Rashaad Penny has only played 8 meaningful games. 8 games in which he's been given 12 or more opportunities. In those games, he's performed very well, but has only been able to do 8 games in 4 seasons, 18, 19, 20, 21. It's something that I'm worried about. And yes, Kenneth Walker is, probably going to start this upcoming season a little bit slower because of the hernia injury and the recovery process there. But we have to just be very careful in the investment of a Rashaad Penny. I certainly believe he's capable of being a top 24 running back and getting into this conversation of being an upper end, RB3. But again, it's purely based on his health. If he's not able to stay healthy like he's pretty much shown over the last couple of years, it's going to be risky. But if we get the Rashaad Penny that we saw last season, or something even just remotely close to that range of where he's able to put up 13, 14 fantasy points in a game per week, we're talking about a player that could very easily jump up the board and jump up this tier list by the end of 2022. Moving on to Chase Edmonds. All right, we have the running back who should be the starting running back of the Miami Dolphins in 2022. Now, here are some of the reasons why I'm so excited about the potential of Chase Edmonds. Since 2019, when he was given 9 or more opportunities within the Arizona Cardinals offense, he was averaging 12.49 fantasy points per game. In the games where he was the lone starting back of the Arizona Cardinals, and had, just pretty much been given the full reign, he was playing 90% of the snap share in those 4 games, averaging 19.43 fantasy points per game. There is a lot of potential upside for Chase Edmonds, especially considering the fact that there's no longer a Myles Gaskin to catch all those passes. Again, last season, Myles Gaskin had 40+ receptions in this offense. If you allocate those in direction of a Chase Edmonds, he gets the receiving work. You get him in an offense that is going to be schematically kind of revolving around running the ball consistently in a Mike McDaniel scheme, formerly offensive coordinator of the San Francisco 49ers. You get an improved offensive line. You bring in weapons like Tyreek Hill that are only going to stretch defenses and force them to not be able to, pretty much stack the box. On top of the fact that Chase Edmonds has the easiest strength of schedule at the running back position in 2022. Check out that video, guys, if you haven't yet already on the channel. My goodness. Chase Edmonds is in a position to succeed in 2022. If he's the lone back, his overall potential upside continues to rise. But even if Sony Michel, Raheem Mostert take away some touches, I don't see that being that big of a deal for Chase Edmonds, considering where he's being drafted and his overall baseline of production. Moving on, we have Cordarrelle Patterson beginning our H tier. Listen, Cordarrelle Patterson's kind of being slept on, and I understand why. Last season, he scored 11 of the offense's total 33 touchdowns. When you're pretty much accounting for 33% of your team's touchdowns, that's a very unsustainable number, especially considering we're talking about an Atlanta Falcons offense. But you never know. Maybe he ends up getting lucky once again and putting up that number. But I highly, doubt that. And because of that dip that we're going to see, whether he's going from 11 touchdowns to 5, again, if you're going to swing 30 points here or there, 36 points here or there, we're in a conversation where his fantasy point per week contribution is going to be lesser. But if you're playing in a league where you can start him as a running back or a wide receiver, his flex production, on top of the fact that he is going to be one of the primary threats of this offense, leads me to wanting to draft him. I know that prior to his injury last season, weeks 1 through 9, he was averaging 16.84 fantasy points per game. Obviously dealt with injury, missed that game against the New England Patriots on Thursday night. After that, only averaged 9.93 fantasy points per game, while also having the toughest strength of schedule at the back end of the year, taking on Tampa Bay, San Francisco, Buffalo, and New Orleans 4 out of the last 7 games. But going into 2022, with Kyle Pitts and Drake London as the only other 2 weapons, Marcus Mariota as a starting quarterback, and this offense pretty much already asserting the fact by giving him a new contract, by not bringing in much competition out of this backfield, losing Mike Davis, we know that he is going to be the primary receiving threat out of this backfield and the primary running back, goal line back in 2022, which only makes me more confident in drafting him this year. Moving on, we have Rhamondre Stevenson. Now, this offseason, I have talked about Rhamondre Stevenson being a budget A.J. Dillon, and I'll tell you why. Since 2019, there have been 36 total running backs that have totaled over 150 rushing attempts and 40 total receptions. Now, the reason why I got to that number is because James White retired recently. They've talked about Rhamondre Stevenson being the 3rd down back of this offense. And if you go ahead and just increase his overall rushing opportunity, considering the fact that this team really doesn't have a Brandon Bolden to step in and take those touches. And outside of, Damien Harris, they're going to have to run the ball somewhere else. Damien Harris only playing 41% of the offensive snaps last season, from week 6 through 18. It looks like Rhamondre Stevenson is going to walk into a lot of opportunities. So if he's able to get those 150 rushing attempts and 40 receptions, over the last 3 years, we've seen 36 running backs accomplish that. 34 of those running backs have put up a minimum of 159 total fantasy points. The only 2 running backs that weren't able to accomplish that were last year, 2021, Myles Gaskin and Saquon Barkley, both hyper inefficient, and at times Barkley missed a lot of time, due to injury. And Gaskin, the dude was catching the ball 40 times, only had 200 receiving yards. That level of production is not something that we'll see out of Rhamondre Stevenson in 2022. We'll see far greater production based on the metrics that he showed in his rookie year. Just to give you some perspective of what 159 half PPR fantasy points equates to, in 2021, that would have made him the number 24 running back. In 2020, that would have made him the number 21 running back. And in 2019, that would have made him the number 23 overall running back. On top of the fact that Rhamondre Stevenson has potentially the keys to the kingdom, if he is able to outwork Damien Harris, if Damien Harris ever goes down with an injury, you were talking about a running back that is going to lead this backfield, and even last season proved that as the full-time starter is a 20-point per game monster. I have a lot of confidence in Rhamondre Stevenson. He's one of those projects I'm investing in my later rounds. Moving on to Antonio Gibson. Man, I don't know if I can trust Antonio Gibson. It's just too difficult at this moment in time based on everything we are hearing. And it may just be, smoke and mirrors. It may be red herrings that are just kind of thrown out there. But, what we saw in the last 2 years from Antonio Gibson being a top 12 running back in fantasy in 2020 and in 2021, it's so difficult to just pivot away from him and get him into that RB3 conversation, because really we're starting to trend towards the Ron Rivera running back by committee situation, where Brian Robinson is a huge threat and J.D. McKissic is stealing all the receiving work. And if you go ahead and you siphon off rushing attempts and red zone opportunity and put that towards Brian Robinson, and you give a lot of receiving threat and upside towards J.D. McKissic, where does that leave the likes of Antonio Gibson, where it leaves him in limbo? If you look at what Ron Rivera has done in seasons past with the Carolina Panthers, whether it was splitting Christian McCaffrey and Jonathan Stewart, or even going before that where they split D'Angelo Williams, Jonathan Stewart, and Mike Tolbert in an offense, we're purely anticipating a running back by committee situation here. And though this offense has given their running backs top 12 numbers in terms of rushing attempts and opportunities, and they have an upper tier offensive line in terms of run blocking, and do get an upgrade at the quarterback position going from Taylor Heineke to Carson Wentz, I'm still concerned about the potential of an Antonio Gibson, because if in fact he is not getting those level of production that he saw last season, it may not be worth the investment. Moving on to Miles Sanders, the next running back I wanted to mention. Okay, here's the deal about Miles Sanders. He is still dealing with an injury, yet he is in a perfect position to succeed behind the best run blocking offensive line in the National Football League. And because of the fact that they've been so good at running the ball, last season they were number 1 amongst all teams in the National Football League in terms of rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. We're only second in terms of total rushing attempts behind the Tennessee Titans. Obviously, the rushing contributions of Jalen Hurts does make a pure difference, mainly because Jalen Hurts stole so many touchdowns from Miles Sanders last season. Sanders scored 0 touchdowns. Very seldom do you ever see a running back have over 100 rushing attempts and not score a single touchdown in a given year. I went ahead, I looked at all the film. Jalen Hurts personally had 5 QB sneaks when Miles Sanders was in the backfield and they were on the 1-yard line. They had many opportunities to give him the ball, but it's just relatively unlucky in that extent. Now, obviously, Miles Sanders this offseason has come out and said, hey, don't draft me in fantasy. I think that was more of a reactionary thing because of how many people who have given him crap online, and he just doesn't want to hear it anymore. But let me put this in perspective. Last season, when he came back from his injury, in the final 4 games of the season that Miles Sanders played, he was averaging 19.73 rushing attempts per game, 121 rushing yards per game, and 13.57 fantasy points per game. That's all without scoring a single rushing touchdown in those last 4 contests that he played. That level of production cannot be ignored. As a late round potential flyer, as a guy that may end up popping off this year in his final year of his rookie contract, perhaps Miles Sanders could be worth the investment this season. Moving on to Devin Singletary. Now, again, this is another one of these running back by committee situations. And though we saw a lot of production out of Devin Singletary late last season, from weeks 14 through the divisional playoffs, in that 7-game stretch was averaging 18.21 fantasy points per game, playing 84% of the offensive snaps. But there are more and more threats being added to the conversation. You bring in James Cook. You still have Zach Moss. You bring in Duke Johnson. That pretty much is going to eliminate any opportunity for Devin Singletary to be a receiving back in this offense, because that's what James Cook and Duke Johnson are there to do. And then you add the idea that, Josh Allen runs the ball as much as any other quarterback in the National Football League. In the last 3 seasons, these are his rushing stats in terms of yardage and touchdowns. 510 to 9 touchdowns, 421, 8 touchdowns, 763 this last season for 6 touchdowns. When you get down to the goal line, Josh Allen's stealing touchdowns. And if Devin Singletary isn't given those guarantee points, well, obviously we're in a tough situation. Yes, this offensive line has made huge improvements. You bring in Quisenberry as the right tackle, Saffold as the left guard. Those are 2 guys that helped the Tennessee Titans over the last 2 years and helped Derrick Henry achieve those goals of being a 2,000-yard rusher. You bring them into this offense, and sure, it should help, but I don't know if there's enough opportunity for Devin Singletary as a lone back, because it really isn't that situation. It's a committee, and because of that, I'll invest in him, but basically as a RB4 with very little flex opportunity in my lineups. Moving on. Okay, we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Of course, his name had to be this big and had to pretty much get cut off, but either way, Clyde Edwards, another one of these running back by committee situations. In the last 2 years, Clyde Edwards has been decent. I mean, when he's been given 13 or more touches a game, he's averaged 11.88 fantasy points per game. That's 16 games of the last 2 seasons. But again, this offense really wants to use multiple running backs. You go back to 2021. In 9 out of the 17 games, there were 2 running backs that had at least 8 or more opportunities in this backfield. In 5 of the games, we saw 2 running backs with 10 or more opportunities. So whether it was Derek Gore, Darrell Williams, CEH, Jerick McKinnon last season, there was a lot of opportunities going around. And, at this current moment in time, Andy Reid doesn't seem like he's committed to a singular running back. He's certainly not committed to giving the ball to Clyde Edwards on the goal line. And at that point, I'm thinking to myself, can I commit to him as an RB on my roster? Especially considering we are hearing a lot of upside from Jerick McKinnon based on the production that we saw in the NFL playoffs from him. We saw Isaiah Pacheco, obviously gaining a lot of head of steam and a lot of hype this offseason, despite being a 7th round selection out of Rutgers. With that all in mind, I'm just not convinced that CEH should be someone that is on my team. But with that all being said, he's going to be given the first crack. He's going to be the starter. And until he loses that, he will have value. Moving on, we have Tony Pollard as the next running back I wanted to mention. Obviously, Tony Pollard has potential upside if, in fact, Zeke goes down with an injury. But with that all said, I understand that many of you think that Tony Pollard is extremely talented and should be the starter. I agree. They should just go ahead and transition it, but they have too much money invested in Zeke. Therefore, we wait until Pollard, in a couple years, is given that full opportunity. I know last season, he was the number 2 running back in terms of yard per carry average, only behind Rashaad Penny. He had a 5.5 yard per carry average last season. He was the number 5 overall running back in yards per carry after contact, averaging 3.61 yards per carry in that manner. Obviously, he's talented. Last season, when given 10 or more opportunities in the game, he's averaging 11.35 fantasy points per game. That's 10 contests. He has flex upside. But the problem I have is that even when Zeke, dealt with that knee injury, had the partially torn PCL, Pollard got less opportunities. He saw less overall production in the weeks where Zeke was injured because they don't trust Pollard to be that number 1 guy. They want Zeke to be that guy from here on out, and they're going to treat it as such. And with that being the case, sure, Pollard can be a upper scaled handcuff, but outside of that, I'm really not too interested in the investment. Moving on, we have Kenneth Walker III, another rookie, a second-round selection, like I mentioned in regards to Breece Hall a little bit earlier. When we're talking about second-round running backs, there is a lot of potential for production, especially being a top 36 running back. 8 out of the last 10 second-round running backs selected since 2017 have been able to achieve that. So why not Kenneth Walker? Obviously, he sits behind Rashaad Penny. Rashaad Penny has only played 8 meaningful games in the last 4 seasons, has dealt with a bunch of injuries, is still ailing from a hamstring injury. But though Kenneth Walker is probably going to start the season off a little bit slow, considering he is recovering from that hernia, eventually he's going to take this job. Whether it's late in the season, whether it's midway through the season, maybe it's a couple weeks into the season, he'll take the job and be the starting running back for the future of the Seattle Seahawks. Again, let's not forget, in his final year of college at Michigan State, he was number 1 amongst all running backs in terms of yards after contact. He was number 7 in yards after contact per attempt, and he was number 1 amongst all running backs in missed tackles forced. He's extremely talented, and I expect over the course of the season to eventually be the starting back of this team, but it's only a matter of how long that takes. Moving on, we have Melvin Gordon as the next running back I wanted to mention. Again, with Javonte Williams being given the guy role of this offense, Melvin Gordon's going to start to fade away a little bit. Now, over the last 2 years, he still averaged 11.7 fantasy points per game. And last year, he played 51% of the snaps while Javonte Williams played 49%. But if we start getting into a conversation where Javonte Williams is playing 65% and Melvin Gordon's relegated to that 35% role, in a West Coast offense that wants to throw the ball as much as they do, and they have Russell Wilson and those threats, again, I think Javonte Williams will be the premier receiving back of this offense, which will eventually, kind of lower the overall upside of a Melvin Gordon, which keeps him in this conversation of being a upper tier handcuff, a guy that could immediately make plays while still being a flex option, but is going to be very much so matchup based. Moving on to Dameon Pierce. Now, look, if Dameon Pierce cannot beat Marlon Mack and Rex Burkhead this upcoming season, I will be extremely surprised. Again, last season, even when Davis Mills was the starting quarterback for this team, they wanted to continue to run the ball in Houston. Again, in the 11 starts that Davis Mills had, the running back position still averaged 21 rushing attempts per game and 6.55 targets per game that led to 5.27 receptions. Overall, the opportunity is there. Now, for those of you who look at what Dameon Pierce had produced in college at Florida, obviously you see that he didn't have a lot of touches, but when we compare him to other running backs over the last couple of years that came out of college that didn't have a lot of touches, we're talking about Alvin Kamara's, we're talking about Antonio Gibson's, players that are going to be third down backs to say the least, but are going to start contributing in the early down work, which is what we've seen already this preseason. I don't think Marlon Mack and Rex Burkhead are going to be able to compete with him. Maybe throughout the beginning of the season, that'll be the case, but over due time, Dameon Pierce will be the starting running back of the Houston Texans, which doesn't present that much value because the cap in terms of total touchdown upside is limited, but there's still a lot of potential opportunity at hand. Moving on to Michael Carter. Again, we mentioned this before in regards to Breece Hall. If Michael Carter is still considered the RB1 of this team, we have to respect that fact. I mean, again, this is a guy that last season, when given 13 or more touches, was averaging 13.98 fantasy points per game in those 8 games that he participated in from weeks 4 through 10, in which he was the starting running back prior to his injury. He was averaging 14.77 fantasy points per game and was the number 13 overall running back in fantasy. He has the ability to get it done between the tackles as a receiving back. And even last season was the number 8 running back in yards after contact per attempt, 3.37, with a minimum of 100 rushing attempts, and was the number 3 overall running back in missed tackles forced per attempt, only behind guys like Javonte Williams and Kareem Hunt. A lot of talent here and potentially a two-headed monster for the New York Jets. Moving on to our final running back. Let's scoot over a little bit here. We have Brian Robinson, the 40th running back I wanted to talk about today, and the final player on our tier list. Brian Robinson should be able to dig into Antonio Gibson's work. We have seen Brian Robinson in college in 2021 with Alabama have 271 rushing attempts lead to 1,300 rushing yards, 14 rushing touchdowns, 35 catches for almost 300 receiving yards. Great production. If we are going to see that Ron Rivera running back by committee situation, by all means, this should be the goal line early down back. And Antonio Gibson, who used to be a receiver in college, should be, relegated to the later down work. Now, there may be a possibility that Antonio Gibson gets completely faded. And if that's the case, Brian Robinson is going to have a lot of opportunity behind a top-tier offensive line and an offense that wants to continue to run the ball, especially considering Carson Wentz is their starting quarterback. Obviously, the history of Alabama running backs has showed that Alabama running backs that join an offense since 2011, since Mark Ingram, that has already been impacted by other running backs, like a committee situation, they've often had struggles finding immediate success. Only when we've seen running backs join the backfield that has no competition, for example, Najee Harris, Josh Jacobs in the last couple seasons, then you find immediate success. But in the case of Brian Robinson this year, I think eventually he will get more and more touches as the weeks progress. We've seen him take first team snaps and reps in preseason games at practice. It's only going to build as this team begins to fade away from Antonio Gibson. All right, those were our top 40 running backs for the 2022 fantasy football season. I want to thank you guys for watching. Again, this was a very long video, but hey, you got to hear my opinion. You got to hear the stats regarding every single one of these players. Be sure to subscribe today. Again, we're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 fantasy football season. Help us crush the goal of 60K subscribers, crush that goal of 70K, and moving forward into the 2022 season. Thank you very much. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, a reminder, for those of you who sign up to Underdog Fantasy between August 25th through August 28th using promo code Andrew and make a first-time deposit, not only will you get a deposit match up to $100, not only will you be giving my half PPR and full PPR draft rankings, but you'll also have a chance to winning $50. 10 of you will have a chance of winning $50 on Monday night's live stream, August 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll be spinning a wheel, determining those 10 winners. $50 a pop of Underdog currency that you can use to draft to improve your draft status this upcoming season and gain more experience prior to your leagues. Thank you everybody for watching. And until tomorrow, we'll be talking about my wide receiver tier list. I'll see you guys. Peace.